My contribution tonight relates to the third in a trilogy of speeches that I've made in this place concerning the fulfilment of a promise that I made when I was appointed as a senator for the state of Queensland, in that I promised to visit every community in my state, where practicable, on a listening tour to determine exactly what was on their minds with respect to their ideals for their communities right across my state. I've now completed that task, although I must admit, Mr Acting Deputy President, that when I was battling 600 or 700 kilometres of unsealed road between Birdsville and Quilpie, I had for a moment there thought that perhaps I should have just promised to go to every second community in the state. But nonetheless, I've now, with the exception of one of two areas in the far remote north in the peninsula, I've visited every community. Mr Acting Deputy President, the challenges for these communities are remarkably consistent, particularly when we get into the more rural and remote areas of my state. There are facts and figures that show that almost 33% of the GDP of my state comes from an area that we would politically be familiar with as the seats or the divisions of Kennedy and Maranoa, and a portion of Capricornia, where there are only 240,000 residents. So 240,000 residents, and thinking about my state's population, 4.4 million people, 240,000 residents are responsible for production of the GDP. And I listened with great interest to the previous speaker, Senator Millen, and I'm just not sure, truly, to be honest, she is in the stratosphere somewhere on her own as she starts to attack the contributions made by the mining and resource sector. Communities that are in the area that I've described, west of the Great Divide and in the Bowen Basin, are suffering now. They're suffering on so many fronts, and if we were to follow the script provided, no one would live west of the Great Divide. Many of these communities, Mr Acting Deputy President, suffer from a lack of essential services. I think progressive governments, and I call upon my own government to pay acute attention to this, have in many respects failed these communities. Those who might remember in my maiden speech, I made the point that there has been a reduction in community services right throughout these communities now over the last 4 or 5 decades, but it is now getting into a critical phase because of, I think, a failure for us to keep up with the technology of communications for these townships. Many of them have difficulty with their fixed lines. They have either no internet service or an inadequate intermittent internet service, or one that's simply too expensive for them to access. The same internet service provided for mums and dads in the Central West for them to use as a platform for education and their own social interactions costs them sometimes 400% more for the same volume of service as we come to expect away in the more populated areas. And on top of this, we're well aware, it's been canvassed in this place many times, the potential impact that will occur if we don't underpin or continue to underpin the Australia Post services that are so important to so many of these communities. In the community of Baduri, the local shire has had to purchase the local post office, and they subsidise it for about $100,000 a year. I'm instructed by them out of the rates receipt for that district. Now imagine that. Imagine us going out here into our communities in the more populated areas in the cities and starting to tell ratepayers that they now have to pay for basic community service obligations, such as the operation of their post office or their postal services, and indeed, in some instances, 3 of the shires out there, for example, were putting $5 million into trying to come up with a solution to do with the delivery of their fixed line service. So these things are horrific. These are in communities that are paying 4 and 5 times the cost of freight that one incurs in the city for the delivery of services, or goods I should say, for retail. And of course this is passed on to very small communities. It's very difficult for these additional and very large cost imposts to be amortised across these much smaller communities. So consequently, the cost of living for many of our communities west of the Great Divide, and I assume the situation is the same in Western New South Wales and Victoria and Northern South Australia and the Northern Territory, and certainly a very large part of Western Australia, where these communities not made up of many people, they don't have the voting voice or the power that you have in some of the more concentrated federal divisions politically. They are essentially without voice as a percentage of whole. Not only do they have these massive cost of living imposts because of the freight, because of the cost of goods and services, they also have to pay additional for our failure of progressive governments to deliver to them the very basic public service obligations or community service obligations. Some of these people, for example, you and I want to go and visit our accountant, then we can do that on the way to work tomorrow, probably, for most Australians. Well, of course, for some of these people, they have to travel thousands upon thousands of kilometres to visit where these professional services are delivered, where they get the most basic of medical or dental services. And I say that we need to start focusing on their needs, not on the basis that they are simply entitled, as they are, in my view, not only on the basis that we as governments, both at a state and federal level, need to subsidise the delivery of these services, but the fact is, if you're not persuaded from a community service obligation, one should be persuaded by the economic argument. Those 240,000 people deliver up over a third of the GDP of my state. They are at about $212,000 per head is their contribution when there are, if you were to amortise the contribution of some of the major populated areas, it's down to as low as $5,000 per head. These things have massive impacts on their ability to conduct their business, massive impacts on the delivery of education and healthcare services, not to speak, of course, of the social engagement that you and I take for granted to either send or receive an email or communicate with our family across the internet. These are people who sometimes can go almost a week without having the capacity to communicate with their young children away at boarding school. Mind you, and I send this out to the mums and dads everywhere, children who are starting in boarding school in some cases as early as grade 1, because there is simply no alternative delivery of education that can be done on a reliable basis. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, my message has been the same right through my 3 speeches. It will remain. It is one of the central mantras that I bring with me to this place. I hope, as I hear my own voice as I'm leaving, I'm saying the same thing. We need to all pay attention to making sure that we provide these Australians, not with exactly the same as what we have, because that's not possible. We understand that and they understand that. But we need to provide them with a much better level of service, even if it is at an additional cost to our government. And most certainly we need to pay attention to providing our base service obligations in areas, particularly in communications, health and education. Once again, Acting Deputy President, I thank you for the opportunity to make that contribution.
Thank you, Senator.